Let me first thank Amit Kapoor for having invited me to come and talk here, and also for having not explained to me what it is that I'm supposed to talk about. Because it says making of new India, from which I deduced that he wanted me to talk about the book that was released day before yesterday, which is titled Making of New India and focuses particularly on the union government. Then I find that this has a focus on sustainable development goals. And it's somewhat difficult to splice the two together. And therefore, what I shall do in the course of my initial remarks is just to make some unstructured comments. And then there is supposed to be a conversation with Amit, which hopefully will bring some clarity into the discussion. Sustainable development goals, as everyone present here knows, whether as goals, whether as targets, whether as indicators, they are much more complicated than the MDGs. And personally, I don't necessarily think that's a very good thing. To my mind, the fewer the goals, the fewer the targets, the fewer the indicators, the more of focus you can bring to policy interventions. But be that as it may, we have the SDGs, the goals, the targets, the indicators. Do realize that in a country like India, we have very serious data problems. We have less of data problems when we are talking about all India level data, macro level data. We have more serious data problems when you are trying to go subnational, looking at state level data, looking at data that is even more disaggregated, looking at data in the social sectors, which is not as simple as devising dashboards for physical infrastructure. So depending on the indicators that eventually the Government of India, that is the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, zeroes down for monitoring progress towards the SDGs, it is going to be a much tougher task than monitoring movement towards the MDGs. For example, I don't know how many of you here know that if I'm going to talk about the social sectors in particular, broadly, the last robust data set that we have in India is still 2011-12. So we will have a debate in the complete absence of data about what is happening in the social sectors. Well, I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get the general sense of it. Whether it is the MDGs or whether it is the SDGs, they become more acceptable when there are movements in the same direction that a government wants to move. A completely external set of goals, targets, indicators, completely alien in a completely different direction from the government of its own, what it wants to do, is not going to work. The good thing about the SDGs is almost all the SDGs, almost all the targets are ones that are in sync with what the government itself wants to do. Now, what does the word government mean? And I want to flag this. In our structure, we have a three-tier structure of governance. There is the union government, there are the state governments, and there are the local governments. Over a period of time, several people have argued that from the point of view of governance, from the point of view of ensuring development, India as a country is excessively centralized. You need to decentralize it. The institutional edifice of excessive centralization that's been built up of over 7 decades is not something that can be dismantled at the stroke of a pen overnight. It's also a question of a mindset. One of the things this government has attempted to do is to incrementally move towards that decentralization. Now let me give you an example of that. We have the Constitution. In the Constitution, we have the 7th schedule, and the 7th schedule sets out what the union government is supposed to do, what the state government is supposed to do, and what is on the concurrent list. It is a matter of constant surprise to me that commentators and journalists do not know that health is entirely a state subject. It is a constant surprise to me that commentators and journalists do not know that the word center does not figure in the Constitution. The moment you use the expression center state, it somehow seems to suggest there's a center sitting there and everything else is a periphery. The word that is used in the Constitution is union government. India is a union. There is no center. It is a matter of constant surprise to me that there's a great deal of obsession and hype surrounding the union government budget, but very little attention to state government budgets, and about 70% of public expenditure now happens at the level of the states. About 50% of capital formation happens at the level of the states, about 70% of public expenditure happens at the level of the states. Almost every social sector, in the social sectors, which is really the SDGs in a way, you will have public schemes, public investment schemes. Now, those are not implemented in state capitals. They are implemented further down. Look at the amount of attention that is paid to the Union Finance Commission, and look at the complete lack of interest to state finance commissions, which pinpoint the amount of devolution, fiscal devolution that happens from the level of the state governments to local bodies. In the final set of comments, I will now quickly focus on the union government, because that is what that book was about. This is a collection of papers, there are 51 of them, about different aspects of the union government. The union government, which has been there for the last 4.5 years, is exactly what it is. It's a union government. Depending on the year, 90 to 95% of national income originates in the states. Many of the things one would like to do happen at the level of the states. Thankfully, India is a democracy, and thankfully there is a parliament or legislature in general. Thankfully, there is a judiciary. So whatever expectations one has on the part of the Modi government have to be realistic expectations. That is, this is not a government which is going to say, I don't care about parliament, I don't care about the judiciary, I don't care about state governments. So there are limited degrees of freedom. Within those limited degrees of freedom, what has this government tried to do? Several things, and I will mention them in bulleted form. The first obvious question to ask, is are people voluntarily poor? Able-bodied people in working age groups aren't voluntarily poor. They are poor because they lack access to certain things which broadly one can call inputs. Those may be roads, they may be water, they may be electricity, they may be gas connections, they may be primary health centers, they may be schools, other forms of transport, financial products, and so on and so forth. India has 600,000 villages. Out of these 600,000 villages, about 125,000 of these villages did not have any of these things. So one conscious attempt of this government has been to ensure, well, the Jan Dhan account that Amit mentioned is one bit, but to ensure roads, LPG gas, electricity. Obviously, as you do more and more things, the bar tends to be raised, justifiably so. So initially, the metric was how many villages have been electrified. Now the metric has changed to how many households have been electrified, etc., etc. Okay, so one set is that. The second set is, all said and done, there will be people who will be poor, however defined. The only way to identify who are the poor people who are therefore beneficiaries of subsidies is through decentralized identification of households. A sample survey may enable you to know what percentage of Maharashtra's population is below whatever poverty line economists may have thought of. It will not enable you to know which particular household is poor. There is something that all of you should be aware of. I presume you are. If you are not, you should be aware of. And this is called the SECC. The SECC has a set of deprivation indicators based on decentralized identification. And increasingly, this is at the household level, and increasingly, whether it is at the union government level, whether it is at the state government level, the SECC is being used to target beneficiaries. There is a challenge of updating the SECC because this was a census done in 2011-12, so obviously there's a huge challenge of updating the database, but that database is increasingly being used and is being spliced to the bank accounts with direct benefit transfers seeded with Aadhaar numbers. In a sense that eliminates multiplicity, it eliminates, reduces leakages. It's still work in progress, but there's an enormous amount that's been done there, not just at the union government level, also at state government levels. The last bit I want to flag is, in doing all of this, the government needs resources. And those resources primarily come through tax revenue. And of course, I'm only mentioning the tax devolution formula of the 14th Finance Commission, which gives much more in untied funds to state governments. But substantively, one needs to have tax reforms. On the tax reform side, there is the direct and there is the indirect. On the indirect side, as all of you know, there's already a GST. The GST is also a work in progress. It is by no means anyone's case that it has reached its terminal goal of an ideal GST, but one is gradually moving towards that. On the direct tax side, there is similarly a task force which has been set up, but the simple line, one-line statement on tax reforms is something that people find difficult to accept often, which is a simplified tax regime with reduced compliance costs requires standardization and harmonization. It requires the elimination of exemptions. To give you one figure, India's tax GDP ratio today is 17% of GDP. about 5 to 5.5% of GDP is lost because of tax exemptions. In other words, if the tax exemptions had not been there, the tax GDP ratio would have been 20 to 22.5%. The trouble with reforming taxes is the obvious one, which is everyone argues, remove the exemptions for other people, but retain them for me. If that's the argument, obviously the tax reform agenda does not get much traction. So this very, very broadly is what this government has been trying to do, while ensuring that there is no deviation from the path of fiscal consolidation, which, as has been repeatedly been said, is something that there will be no deviation from. Thank you very much.